Thank you so much, Drew, for that wonderful and very generous introduction, and I always have a difficult time recognizing myself in these introductions. Sort of like, there's two me's. There's the evil twin that goes on the road and takes all the credit, and then there's the good twin that stays home, does all the work, and never gets recognized. And I never know which one I am at any given point. In any case, thank you so much for coming for this talk. As Drew mentioned, I am I'm technically not an expert in Islam, though I've maintained an ongoing interest in Islamic polities, Islamic societies, and so forth, both inside as well as outside of the Philippines. A topic that, of course, has become even more pressing in today's global situation. In any case, I have about 50 minutes, maybe 45 minutes. Yeah, what I want to do today is something very basic, very simple, but at the same time, I hope sufficiently suggestive and sufficiently provocative as to stir certain questions that could maybe take us in all kinds of different directions. One of the things that's always interested me about Islam as a phenomenon, coming from the background of colonial and post-colonial studies and coming as someone who does primarily Philippine and Southeast Asian studies, is the way in which Islam, like the other great monotheisms of our time, exceed any sort of regional or national boundaries we might want to put into them. In other words, they are inherently transnational, historically as well as sociologically. They're all inherently transnational. So on the one hand, they exceed whatever national boundaries we might put in them, whatever cultural boundaries, linguistic boundaries we might put on them. On the other hand, the historical particularity and the institutional realities of Islam can only take place within, at least in the modern period, within specific national state formations. So on the one hand, they exceed the nation state. On the other hand, one can't really apprehend them in all their historical specificity, and one can't really engage the institutional reality of Islam except within a specific nation state formation. Right? So it's that doubleness of Islam, simultaneously inside and outside, simultaneously in excess of the nation state, and yet held captive to the contingencies of the nation state, that fascinates me with this phenomenon, and to which much of my comments on Islam in the Philippines will be directed to. We can see this doubleness of Islam, which is, as I emphasize, is not simply specific to Islam. It's we can see this doubleness of Islam if we take a look at the history of Islam in the Philippines. And I apologize doubly for using this rather crude technology of the overhead. Every time I've tried to do PowerPoint, it's failed. Overhead never fails me. I love analog technology. I mean, digital is very useful, but there's something to be said about analog. It's too bad my turntable isn't working. But number one, and then number two, so we give up a certain sexiness for a certain dependability, right? I don't know, what is this, experience rather than change? I don't know. But the second thing is that no more boring way to start talking with a map. But let me just put the map up really quickly just to give us a sense of geographical orientation, and then I'm going to move on to other things, I promise, in the course of the talk. This, of course, is a map of the Philippines. And the only reason why I wanted this up here is I wanted to indicate the areas that I'm going to be talking about. These are the areas where Islam has had an early and enduring impact as compared to the rest of the islands. Which of course is in the area that is indigenously known as Maguindanao, but which subsequent colonial powers from the Spaniards onwards to the present-day Philippine government have abbreviated to Mindanao. And the Sulu Archipelago, which is this area, and what's not shown in this map is that Islam has also impacted the island, parts of the islands of Palau. And so the southern location of Islamic influence is going to be crucial, as I'm going to talk about in a second, so that what we think of as the Philippines, this archipelagic region, which we now think of as the Philippine nation state, actually came belatedly in relation to the impact of Islam, which is in the south. Another map. Again, I apologize, but as I said, hopefully it will be better. Now, Islam preceded, in some ways, the formation of the Philippines. And I actually have slides to my notes to make it easier. We'll come back to this in a second. As you can see, I just wanted to point out the relationship of the Philippine archipelagic region to the Indonesian archipelago, the Malaysian peninsula, right? In particular, the Straits of Malacca, right here, which will be very important to understand how it is that Islam came to the Philippines. And this, of course, is the Pacific Ocean, China Sea, Indian Ocean, India is right here, and so forth, South China Sea. I do this primarily for myself. It helps me think. You don't have to follow it. But this is my version of the analog sort of PowerPoint. Islam, as I said, preceded the formation of the Philippines. And we might think of the first phase of Islamic expansion in the Philippines between the late 13th to the middle of the 18th century. It was in the late 13th to 14th century that Islam began to spread in island Southeast Asia, largely as a result of increasing trade contacts with the Indian subcontinent, which in turn was increasingly in contact with traders from the Middle East. And this resulted in the rise of very important trading state, Malacca, which is, as you remember from the map, is right on the tip of the Straits of Malacca, became the most powerful kingdom, the first and most powerful Muslim kingdom in Southeast Asia. Its power deriving from two things. Number one, its geographical location on the Straits of Malacca, with its ability to control the flow of trade in and out of those areas. Secondly, from the presence of a kind of Islamic political structure, religious political structure, that endowed its rulers with a new basis of legitimacy. Right? And everywhere Islam went to Southeast Asia, this was the same story. Islamic polities began to flourish in Southeast Asia at this time, 13th, 14th century, precisely because Islam provided Southeast Asian rulers, particularly on the coast, with a whole set of ritual, political vocabulary to project power, to attract following, right, increase their prestige, all of which were very necessary in order to, as I said, build up their power in relation to other local rulers. One thing that's interesting in the history of the spread of Islam in Southeast Asia is that it was, as I said, primarily a commercial and political phenomenon. The religious aspect of Islam tended to be downplayed, in part because there were more traders rather than religious scholars, figures that accompanied the spread of Islam. Historically, the power of the sultans, the rajas, and so forth tended to be emphasized over the power of the ulama, or the religious teacher. There's always been kind of a tension between those two, and it's always been the power of the local ruler as a representative, as the embodiment of things Islamic, rather than the power of the religious scholar that's always been emphasized. The other characteristic of the spread of Islam in Southeast Asia is its tendency to mold itself into existing local beliefs, right? Despite of the monotheistic thrust of Islam that set it apart from existing religions, animistic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so forth in the region. Nonetheless, the kind of Islam that found its way in Southeast Asia tended to be much more open to adaptation to local beliefs. In part, this had to do with the sort of Sufi orientation, the kind of Islam that spread in Southeast Asia, so that Islam, rather than abolish local beliefs, absorbed them, and vice versa. I mean, there's a lot of syncretism, a lot of hybrid formation. Islam did not so much disrupt existing religious beliefs in Southeast Asia, but one could say enhance them, elaborate them. Just as Islam did not so much disrupt existing political relations, notions of power, for example, in Southeast Asia, as add a complicating layer over them. This is exactly what happened when Islam came to those parts of the archipelago in the south. By the 15th and the 16th century, you had not just the spread of Islamic influence, but the emergence of Islamic polities. in the areas that I pointed out in the map, the Sulu Archipelago, as well as parts of Maguindanao. At this point, you have the emergence of supra-village organizations, centralized super-village organizations where leaders began to call themselves sultans or rajas and so forth and so on, increasing their influence as far north as the Visayas Islands, all the way up to Manila. The impact of Islam on these pre-colonial societies can't be appreciated unless one has a sense of what these pre-Islamic societies were like. Prior to the coming of Islam, the native societies in the Philippine archipelago were by and large characterized as relatively autonomous chiefdoms, what we might call them as chiefdoms. They existed relatively autonomous of one another. They were not clustered into a large, again, super-village organization. There were no centralized state systems. There were no massive religious, political complexes. Hinduism was barely felt. Buddhism was barely a blip on the historical landscape. People, by and large, animistic, living in small coastal villages, some in the interior, for the most part, in an uneasy relation of alliances and war with one another. Much of the, again, as in the case of many island Southeast Asia polities, Philippine polities at this point were characterized by notions of power based on prestige. That is to say, prestige meaning the number of followers. One was a powerful chief to the extent that one had a large following. The larger the amount of following you had, the more powerful one was. Power was based on, if you will, manpower rather than on land. Land itself was immaterial to the number of people that followed you. Why was this the case? This was because so much of the socio-political, religious life of these villages revolved around a cycle of trading, raiding, and feasting. Trading, that is overseas trade as well as interior trade with other coastal areas in Asia, all the way up to China, right? And trading, which entailed the building of rather large seagoing vessels, which then required enormous amounts of manpower, not just for the building and manning of these ships, but also for the collection of jungle products, which were highly valued in various parts of Southeast Asia as well as in East Asia. And the collection and the building of these boats and the collection of products depended on having access to considerable amounts of manpower. Where did you get that manpower? You went out and raided. In other words, slavery, right? All of these societies were built on an economy of slavery, whereby most of the slaves came by way of war. One raided villages. Most of the slaves were as a result of these raids. And slavery was absolutely intrinsic to the sustenance of these pre-colonial villages. And finally, feasting, whereby the surplus that had been accumulated could then be dispensed and socially redistributed, thereby adding to the power and prestige of the particular chief. Islam did not so much disrupt this pattern as add to it, enhance it, emphasize it, as we'll see in a second. This is one reason why Islam, as I said, was in some ways, it seemed so congenial to the native societies when it first began to be felt in the 14th and 15th century. However, things changed dramatically between 1565 and 1571. Halfway around the world, Spanish conquistadors came, began to establish the first permanent settlement in the Philippines, on their way to trying to find alternative routes to the west, gaining access to the spices that were in the Indonesian archipelago. Along the way, they accidentally bumped into the Philippines, decided to establish bases there, and thus began a period of colonization which would last for 333 years. Something very interesting about Spanish colonialism that's worth mentioning in relation to the spread of Islam. Spanish colonization, unlike British, Dutch, French colonization, came right out of a long medieval tradition of the Reconquista. Right? These are the centuries-long crusades against the Muslim population that had occupied El Andalus, right? The colonized Iberian Peninsula for over 7 centuries. And when the Spaniards came to the Philippines, halfway around the Pacific, and discovered, much to their horror, these very same Moors that about 40 years ago they had just finished kicking out of the last kingdom of Granada. You can see the sort of surprise that met them. Rather than try and absorb them into a larger colonial context, as the British and the Dutch had done, instead they were intent on basically repeating what they had done in Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula, just getting rid of it. It was that the idea was they would either have to convert to Christianity or they would have to be expelled. There was no room, there was no two ways about it. And indeed, this is one of the things that characterized Spanish colonialism that made it quite different from other European colonialisms, the insistence on conversion to Christianity, right? That you could not be a Spanish colonial subject unless you were also simultaneously Christianized. There was no way to be otherwise. Spanish rule, in effect, limited the spread of Islam. Just as Islam was beginning to head north, the coming of the Spaniards effectively limited its spread. At the same time, the Spaniards, because of the fact that they had limited resources and because of the distance of the Philippines, were unable to continue the conquest of Islam, or the conquest of the South. Essentially, Spanish colonialism had the effect of introducing a novel division in the archipelago, splicing the archipelago into two, between those who submitted and therefore converted to Christianity and those who resisted, because they had the means to resist, in this case, the sultanates of the south, right? And therefore remain outside of the colonial polity, right? Those inside eventually became subjects, converted to Christianity, and eventually came to be known as Filipinos by the 19th century. Those who were outside refused Christianity, refused to recognize the sovereignty of the Spanish king, came to be known as infieles, unfaithful, infidels, right? Savages, non-Christian, therefore non-Filipino. Now, this brings us to the next part of our story. The fact that the Islamicized areas of the Philippines remain outside of Spanish control meant that they would develop in a way remarkably different from the rest of the colony. The rest of the colony was effectively integrated into the larger Spanish Empire, administered as a province of Mexico, of New Spain. So the Philippines, until Mexican independence in 1821, essentially was part of the viceroyalty of Spain. For the South, right, they developed in an entirely different way, oriented away from the Spanish Empire and much more towards island Southeast Asia and the Malaysian Peninsula. The Sultanates in Sulu and Maguindanao, as I said, developed essentially in opposition to the Spanish, as it were, the tail end of the Spanish Empire, which was just right above North This Sultanate tended to be much more oriented towards island Southeast Asia, whereas the Philippine colony was much more oriented towards the Pacific, the New World, in Spain. So whereas the rest of Christianized, Hispanized Philippines was connected to the New World by way principally of the galleons, and therefore in some ways was closer to a trans-Pacific, transatlantic world, the South, in the meantime, was much more connected to a larger Indonesian, Malaysian archipelago, dealing with not the Spaniards, but the British and the Dutch, whose presence was increasingly becoming more and more palpable. This world that emerged was to be known by some scholars as the Sulu Zone, Sulu because of the power of the Sulu Sultanate over this area. And the Sulu Zone was a zone that became particularly important and particularly prosperous during the middle of the 18th century till about the middle of the 19th century. For an entire 100 years, it thrived on trade with the Chinese, with the Dutch, with the English, and with the rest of the Indonesian archipelago. The British and the Dutch were particularly anxious to trade with the Sulu people because they offered products, jungle products like mother of pearl, tortoise shells, bird's nest, extremely important, all sorts of medicinal plants, etc., etc., etc. These things which were very labor intensive to gather. and which were in high demand by the Chinese. This high demand in China. British and the Dutch wanted to get these products in order to redress the rather lopsided balance of trade they enjoyed in China. Because remember, this was before the Industrial Revolution. The British and the Dutch didn't have very much to offer the Chinese, unlike the Spaniards, who had at least New World silver, right? That the Chinese wanted, and so they could do that with the galleon trade. The British and Dutch didn't have anything. Instead, they were forced to go down, get these products from the Sultanate of Sulu, and give them, or rather trade them with China. In exchange, the British and the Dutch had something that the Sulu Sultanate wanted: guns and weapons. Guns and weapons, which they needed in order to increase, right, the means of their production. And the means of this production was, of course, slavery. It was this time that the enormous wealth, the influence of the Sulu Sultanate was in part predicated on the increasing ability to raid and accumulate slaves. It was during this period that slave raiding in the Philippines, slave raiding in island Southeast Asia increased. And without these slaves, it would have been impossible for the Sulu Sultanate to maintain its influence in the world. Let me show you. The slave raiding was particularly targeted north. Right? They raided slaves in other parts of the Indonesian archipelago itself. But it was really the Philippine coastal towns that were targeted. Here you see the arrows of the routes. They went up and down. They had these amazing crafts, these very fleet ships that could go up and down and deliver stunning, surprising blows. Every single coastal community, as you can see, these are all over the Philippines, were targeted for these annual raids. The Spaniards, by and large, could do very little to protect the inhabitants of these towns. Entire villages would be carted off and enslaved and brought back to Sulu to serve the requirements, the labor requirements of the areas. Balangigi, this little island here, was the major staging ground for the slave raids that went up and down the Philippine archipelago, which, as I said, was a regular occurrence. The Spaniards were largely unable to stop this. It is, however, important to emphasize the fluid conditions of slaves who had been captured by the Sultanate. The very complicated, again, as in the case of many Southeast Asian polities, very complicated situation of slaves. These slaves were not simply chattel. They were that. Chattel in the sense that they were bought and sold, used as currency, for example, to barter and trade with other commodities. But these slaves were also easily assimilated into these Muslim communities. There were many ways in which they were assimilated. They could serve as domestic servants. They could intermarry with the local population. They could convert to Islam, in which case they could stop being enslaved because Islam forbade enslaving fellow Muslims. You could only enslave infidels. They could buy themselves out of slavery, and one of the ways in which they could buy themselves out of slavery was to join the slave raids. In fact, overwhelming majority of slave raiders were themselves slaves who were rewarded with their own slaves, right? That then allowed them to eventually accumulate enough property in order to buy themselves eventually freedom. So you have a situation in Maguindanao where by the time you get to the late 18th, 19th century, you have the emergence of new ethnic groups made up entirely of former slaves who had managed to free themselves and form their own ethnic communities and engage in their own slave raids. Right? So this was the cycle. Slavery was extremely important. By the 1840s, the Spaniards began to try to regroup. By the 1840s, the Spaniards had lost all of their Spanish-American colonies. All they were left with by the 1840s were their Caribbean holdings, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and their Pacific holdings, Guam, some of the Pacific islands, and of course the Philippines. And at the same time, Spain was trying to, as it were, consolidate its rule over its remaining islands. And this was a period when they tried to push back the Muslims and tried to reconquer those areas in the Philippines that had been relatively untouched by Spanish rule. A key to this reconquest in the 1840s was the use of the steamship. Introduction of steamship technology enabled them to launch rather effective raids against the Muslims, allowing them to establish naval bases in Zamboanga and other parts of Mindanao to use in order to hit back, culminating in the burning of Jolo, which was the capital of Sulu in the 1840s. However, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on which side you're on, the Spanish were unable to maintain this sort of attempted reconquest of the Muslims, in part because of a whole series of things. Number one, there were problems in the Spanish Peninsula. If you remember the 19th century, those of you remember your European history, the 19th century was a time of unending and ongoing strife in Spain itself, beginning with the Napoleonic invasions of 1808, right? The rapid shifts in liberal conservative governments, revolutions of 1868, on and on and on and on. So problems in the peninsula made it impossible for Spaniards to sustain this sort of military attack on the Sultanate, plus the fact that by the time you get to the 1890s, there's a revolution in Cuba, and by 1896, there's a revolution in the Philippines, all of which act as major distractions to the Spanish government. The most serious distraction, of course, is the war against the United States. 1898, if you remember, the United States, led by Commodore Dewey, steamed from Hong Kong, and within an afternoon destroyed what was left of the Spanish Armada, bringing to a rather inglorious end the rule of Spain in the Philippines. The United States was then stuck with the problem of how to control the Philippines, particularly those areas that had been outside, by and large, the control of the Spaniards. And one of the things they did, especially where the Sulu Sultanate was concerned, a Sulu Sultanate which had been considerably weakened from its apogee in the middle of the 18th century because of its encounters with the Spaniards. One of the things they did was to quickly strike a treaty with the Sultan, with the different sultanates of Maguindanao and Jolo, collectively known as the Bates Treaty of 1899. This Bates Treaty of 1899 provided for U.S. recognition as well as financial support of the different sultanates. They would provide a modest allowance, as it were, for the support of the Sultanate, recognize their power, promise not to proselytize, right? Not to try and convert them into Christianity, not to mess with any religious matters. In exchange, the Sultanates would agree to allow the military to establish a string of bases in these areas and would cooperate in putting down resistances, because there were all these sporadic, very, very violent resistances during this early period of U.S. colonial rule, and with the collaboration of the Sultanates, the United States were able to consolidate its rule in the Muslims, and for the first time, the Muslims came under European, or in this case, Anglo-American colonial rule, beginning a new phase in the history of this area, a phase characterized by the eventual integration of the South with the North, right? And with the emergence, by the time you get to the early part of the middle part of the 20th century, of the first Muslim Filipinos. The first Muslim Filipinos will emerge around this point. U.S. colonial rule in the Philippines lasted, formal U.S. colonial rule in the Philippines lasted between 1899 to 1941. And U.S. colonial rule would decisively change the relationship between Muslims in the South and the rest of the Filipinos up north. Right? One of the things that happened was that the United States decided to divide the Philippines and administer them into two zones. One was the civilized Christian zones, right? Those that had been under Spanish rule, where a majority of the people had been converted to Christianity. And they placed the zone under American, a combination of American and Filipino civilian rule. The other, so-called wild zones, uncivilized, untamed, savage, quote-unquote, zones, were placed under American military rule, right? These distinctions were not new. These distinctions were distinctions that the Spaniards themselves had made. And so the United States essentially built on the foundation racial, religious distinctions that the Spaniards had introduced and used this as a basis for reorganizing the colony into two distinct administrative zones. Now, by separating them, ironically, the United States would bring the two apart. Right? That's the effect of the segregation. Segregation, at the same time, meant placing both under a common sovereignty, under the common sovereignty of the United States, something that the Spaniards had never been able to do. As I said, Mindanao itself, the entire area of Mindanao, including Sulu, was categorized under the latter category of the uncivilized non-Christian and given the name Moro province. So even the name itself is suggestive. Moro, of course, is a Spanish name for Muslim, right, derived from Moroccan, right? And the fact that the United States used that name to designate this group already, again, is an indication of the way in which the United States was using Spanish colonial categories in order to enact its own rule, which is why, footnote, it's very interesting to look at because this is a systematic pattern in U.S. colonial rule, which is that the U.S. colonial rule was not exceptional. It was not different from European colonial rule. It was completely parasitic on British and Spanish colonial styles of ruling. There was nothing exceptional about the United States, right, in that sense. They were neither more benevolent nor more cruel. They were just colonial rulers like everyone else that preceded them. Now, they were then sustained between 1903 and 1912. The Moro province, so-called, was administered by the U.S. military. Right? The U.S. military did this on the reasoning that, number one, these people were wild and untamed because they were unchristian. Right? Number two, that they were unconquered. They never lived under the thumb of a colonial ruler and therefore needed the strong, disciplined guidance, as it were, of the military force. Number two, the assumption, again, a racial one, was that civilized Filipinos, so-called, had been, as it were, ineffective in ruling themselves. How could they possibly rule another people, right? So the conviction on the part of the U.S. military that Filipinos themselves would be unable to rule this part of the area made it, to their opinion, necessary for the U.S. military to administer this territory. There were then several attempts throughout the early 20th century to separate Mindanao from the rest of the Philippines, the most famous one being the Bacon Bill of 1921 that would have created Mindanao into a separate protectorate under American rule. And in an attempt to do this, the American government for a while sought to encourage Americans to settle what they called the New Frontier. Mindanao was going to be the new frontier. This was, in a way, a recreation of Texas. Visions of American cowboys, sort of, going out there and setting up frontier areas. All of this was sort of envisioned for Mindanao. All of this came to failure, right? None of this ever worked. The vision of Mindanao becoming a separate protectorate with Americans settling Mindanao all failed. Incidentally, there was also a lot of interest among African Americans in Mindanao. For a while, they thought that Mindanao could be something like Liberia, where they could get their 40 acres and a mule. And there were several African Americans who actually came and looked over Mindanao, thinking that, oh, it's tropical, it's like the South, we can have, our own sort of space here, it'll be good. None of that ever came about. In part because the status, not just of Mindanao, the political status, not just of Mindanao, but also of the Philippines, remained consistently ambiguous. The U.S. Congress, which had the authority to decide on the status of the Philippines, was constantly sort of hesitant to decide on what its final future will be. Is it independence? Is it a protectorate? Is it a territory? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. Congress could never quite decide once and for all what the future of the Philippines would be. And it was because of this indecisiveness and uncertainty that many Americans, and in fact there were very few Americans who actually came and tried to settle Mindanao, that many of them decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Right? So there's very little incentive to actually settle Mindanao. In addition, Filipino nationalists were fiercely opposed to the idea of separating Mindanao as far as they were concerned. They were very committed to seeing the Philippine archipelago as part of a future independent Philippines. They thought that American criticisms of Filipino abilities to rule Muslims was racist, which it was. And so for them it was a matter of pride, political as well as racial, to insist that no, 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 Mindanao must be part of the Philippines. Yes, 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 we as Filipinos, as Christians, can also rule, have our own colony, as it were, of Muslims, and prove ourselves capable of doing this. There's all this fierce opposition. Finally, in 1913, things took a dramatic change. Colonial policy changed. The Democrats won office under Woodrow Wilson, and the U.S. colonial policy towards the Philippines became much more defined. The United States now committed itself to eventually granting independence to the Philippines, and in doing so, committed to Filipinizing colonial administration. That is to say, replacing American administrators with Filipinos whenever and wherever possible, including American administrators in Mindanao. Mindanao itself was renamed, and from becoming Moro province, it now became the Department of Sulu in Mindanao, and were now administered by Christian Filipinos. At the same time, Muslim elites were steadily co-opted into the colonial bureaucracy. They were given local positions. They were encouraged to attend public schools, universities in Manila. They were encouraged to participate in party politics and to run for office in national elections. So much so that between the 1920s and the 1930s, what you have is, as I said, the emergence of the first generation of Muslim Filipinos. Muslim Filipinos, mostly among small, educated elites. And it's very interesting because it really follows the pattern of colonial rule everywhere, right? It's the elites who are first drawn into the colonial system. They are then made to become habituated to a system of rewards and incentives and patronage and privileges emanating from Manila as well as Washington. So they become invested in the system as well. And this steady integration of at least that top part, the elite part of Muslim society, became even more pronounced after World War II, when Muslims found themselves fighting on the side of the Filipino and United States forces against the Japanese and becoming drawn into post-war Reconstruction developments. However, this process of integration would not last long. This as it were, a peaceful relationship, a relatively peaceful relationship between Muslim South and the Christianized Filipino North would last only until about the late 1950s, 1960s. By the time you get to the 1960s, trouble begins to brew. Rebellion begins to emerge. And that is because conditions in the Philippines begin to change. Which brings us to the fourth and final part of this little historical sketch that I want to bring out. By about the 1960s to the present, what we've seen in Mindanao is the emergence of a cycle of rebellion, temporary, uneasy accommodation, and the failure of these attempts at accommodation, usually in the form of granting autonomy between the 1960s and the present. This turbulent period, unceasing turbulent period, is rooted in the 1930s. Muslim discontent, which we see continue today, is rooted in the events in the 1930s, in part or in large part owing to phenomena of mass migration to Mindanao. The idea of Mindanao as a frontier region, as an area to be settled, as a place rich in land and minerals that was waiting to be developed, that was always a constant image of Mindanao in the minds of national leaders. And for that reason, there was a lot of attempt to settle the area. Now, if you recall, American settlers failed to do this. But their places were taken over by the Japanese. When the American settlers left, starting around the 1930s, you now had a flood of Japanese coming to settle parts of Mindanao, particularly the province which is now called Davao. Excuse me. The Japanese settlers, many of which were, it's actually Japanese itself is a misnomer because many of them are from Okinawa. So the question of to what extent they were Japanese is itself a real question. But many of them were encouraged by the Japanese government, seeking to find footholds in Southeast Asia as part of an ongoing plan, of course, for what then would eventually become the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. They were encouraged to migrate, usually coming as large families, and their attempts to develop Mindanao proved to be enormously successful. They made Mindanao one of the most profitable export areas in the Philippines, largely through their cultivation of abaca, Manila hemp for rope, rubber, rice, and many other products. And as I said, under the Japanese, Mindanao turned enormous profits, became incredibly rich area. In part, they succeeded also because of the cooperation they won from Filipino officials. Filipino law forbade foreigners from acquiring more than a certain amount of land. And in order to get around these legal requirements for land possession, Japanese would often hire Filipinos to serve as dummies, dummy owners, pose as owners. They would buy the land under their name, and in exchange, of course, the Japanese would give them generous bonuses. Some of them were local officials, and some were even national officials. And the Japanese would contribute generously into their political campaigns, allowing them in return to accumulate all this land. So it was a very amicable relationship between Filipino officials and the Japanese settlers in Davao. So plentiful were the Japanese settlers in Davao that in the maps of the Japanese planners in Tokyo, Davao was known as Davao-ku, basically a province of Davao. Now, all of this, of course, changed dramatically after World War II. It turns out that many of these settlers, in fact, actively joined the Japanese occupation military, and after World War II were forced to leave. And in the process of leaving, they left behind the infrastructure for a future plantation economy that was to emerge in Mindanao. Now, this is because, in part, because during the last days of World War II, Manila and the major metropolitan areas of the northern part of the Philippines were those that sustained the most amount of damage. Mindanao, by contrast, was hardly damaged at all, so much of the infrastructure was still left. And it was very easy, therefore, by the 1950s, for rich Filipino families to move in, along with large American agribusinesses, principally Castle and Cook, that started to establish these large plantations, banana plantations, pineapple plantations, Del Monte, and so forth and so on. And these were huge company towns, very much like the kinds of stuff that you would see perhaps in Hawaii, much more sophisticated operations by then. At the same time, the entry of rich Filipinos, large American agribusiness companies, emergence of huge plantations, coincided with mass migrations of Filipinos from Luzon and the Visayas, many of whom were escaping land shortages, right, demographic pressures, as well as social conflict. Most notable, the Hope Balahap Rebellion in the late 1940s and 1950s, mostly in central Luzon, which was a direct result of struggles over land, right? The problems of tenancy and so forth. Trying to escape those problems, many of them began to immigrate to Mindanao, where land was plentiful. Some of this migration was state-sponsored, but most of it was strictly voluntary. That is to say, people would immigrate, then their families would follow, and then so on in sort of hopscotch fashion. At its height, there were as many as 3,000 families a week migrating into Mindanao, mostly from the Visayan Islands, and a substantial number from the central Luzon areas. Muslims, as well as indigenous people, that is to say, non-Islamicized people that lived side by side with the Muslim population, were, of course, displaced because of this mass migration. It was only a matter of time before problems would begin to emerge between the Muslim population and native population and migrants that were, Christian migrants that were coming in. Many of them began to feel squeezed out. Many of them began to lose land. In part, this had to do with the way in which land laws were crafted in Manila. In order to own land, you had to have a title and you had to have a cadastral survey, right? Which meant literacy, access to courts, and money. Now, most Muslims had none of these, and as a result, lost their land, either to settlers or to rich Filipino families or to American agribusinesses, which could manipulate land laws in order to buy the land from under them. And as a result, as I said, many of them began to wake up one day and discover that they were squatters in their own land, right? And feeling deprived and displaced because of this. Now, the situation, the growing tension over land was made worse over the fact that there was now Wide availability of weapons in Mindanao. This is always what happens after a major war. I mean, lots of weapons are left over, right? So you have this really volatile situation. Discontent over land, demographic pressures, growing suspicion between settlers and native and Muslim population, and lots of guns. Right? So it was only a matter of time before this series of situations evolved, and eventually paramilitary groups emerged to fight over turf and to air out grievances. They were the most notorious groups being the Ilagas. These were mostly made up of paramilitary groups of settlers, and some of them supported by large landlords and agribusinesses. And then there were the Barracudas, mostly made up of Muslims and some native peoples battling it out. By the 1960s, these paramilitary groups had become so widespread that Mindanao became a site of gunfights on a daily basis, and it became more and more. And of course, it was made worse by the fact that the government often sided with the settlers in all kinds of ways. They devoted resources to developing settler communities, providing electricity, paving roads, government services. None whatsoever for the Muslim communities. No electricity, no roads, no schools, and so on. So Muslims understandably felt incredibly aggrieved by all the situation. By the 1960s, this combination of factors would develop or would result in the emergence of a Muslim secessionist movement. The earliest Muslim secessionist group being the Mindanao, the Muslim independence movement in the 1960s, which would then be succeeded by the more widespread and more successful Moro National Liberation Front under the leadership of Nur Miswari. Nur Miswari is an interesting character. Nur Miswari was Tausug from Sulu, relatively very, very modest means, but through government scholarship was able to get a scholarship to go to Manila, studied at the University of the Philippines, was a political science major, and while there became very good friends with Jose Maria Sison and many of the leaders who eventually formed the New People's Army and the Communist Party of the Philippines. So Nur Miswari was someone who was largely secular, very much influenced by Marxist, Maoist, Leninist ideals, and very much influenced by third world liberation movements that were going on at this time. He eventually went back to Mindanao to teach school and became involved in organizing around the Muslim secessionist movement, and as I said, eventually came to head the Mindanao, the Moro National Liberation Front. An indication of the largely secular third world nationalist orientation of this early secessionist movement, you can see in its name. It doesn't call itself the Muslim Liberation Front, it calls itself the Moro Liberation Front, taking what was formerly a name of, basically a racist name, right, that the Spaniards had given to the Muslims, taking that and re-signifying it. Making it into a term of pride rather than a term of shame. A move that was very typical of a lot of third world nationalist movements at this time. By 1972, things had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. Marcos, who had become president in 1965, tried to hang on to power by declaring martial law in 1972. And one of the things he wanted to do with martial law was he wanted to use the power of the Philippine military to stamp out all opposition forces, the New People's Army, the Communist New People's Army, and the Moro National Liberation Front. Under Marcos, all-out war was declared against the Moro National Liberation Front, and Mindanao, between 1972, in fact through most of the 1970s, was a scene of incredible devastation, constant warfare, brutal back and forth between the Muslims and the military. However, this could not last long. Marcos not only propagated scorched earth policy, but at some point by the mid-70s was forced to look for diplomatic alternatives. There were several reasons for this. One, this was a time of the oil embargo. Marcos wanted to secure oil, a steady oil supply in the Philippines. In that sense, he had to find a way of placating the increasing complaints on the part of the Middle Eastern Muslim countries, particularly Libya and particularly Egypt, Saudi Arabia, about the situation with the Muslims in the Middle East, which at that time was emerging in parallel with the plight of the Palestinians, right? And this is around the time the PLO was attracting worldwide attention and so forth. Secondly, Marcos also wanted to encourage friendships with the Middle East because this was the time he was beginning his program to send Filipino workers overseas. And the first group of OCWs, overseas contract workers, were destined for the Middle East. We wanted to make sure that that avenue was protected. Thirdly, Marcos wanted to basically develop an alternative to the United States. The United States had increasingly become critical of martial law. And one of the things that Marcos wanted to do was to project an image of himself as a modernizing nationalist with an independent foreign policy. And so what did he do? He opened up diplomatic relationships with China. At the same time, he tried to open up diplomatic relations with the Middle East, working with the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries. The key element to Marcos's diplomatic salvo was Imelda, his wife, who he then sent to the Middle East on a diplomatic journey, charming her way with all the Middle Eastern leaders. I've got a terrific picture of her with until finally she manages to arrange a meeting with Muammar Gaddafi, who had been, this is a horrible picture, Muammar Gaddafi looks like somebody from Rocky Horror Picture Show. But Gaddafi had been an early ardent supporter of the MNLF, providing them arms, training, and so forth, just as he had with many other third world liberation movements. And Imelda Marcos thought that perhaps she could strike a deal with him. And of course, she charmed the pants off the guy. She claims that Muammar Gaddafi fell instantly in love with her, insisted that she stay in Libya, promised that he would give her the world if she converted to Islam, etc., etc., etc. Of course, this is from Imelda's. Consider the source. In any case, Imelda's diplomatic forays actually paid dividends. By 1976, the Philippine government managed to conclude an agreement brokered by Gaddafi called the Tripoli Agreement of 1976. It would provide for peace in exchange for a measure of Muslim autonomy. But Muslim autonomy within the context of Philippine sovereignty. What did this mean? It meant that Muslims would have self-government over predominantly Islamicized provinces. They would have their own legislature. They would have a power to tax. They would have their own judiciary, right? And that the MNLF forces would be integrated into the armed forces of the Philippines, right? Never worked. Never worked. The peace agreements were never completely brokered. The MNLF decided to form a tactical alliance with the New People's Army that was then beginning to grow in the northern part of Mindanao. The fighting continued, and by 1986, Marcos himself was in trouble, eventually overthrown by people power, and it was left to his successors, first Cory Aquino, and then eventually Fidel Ramos, to try and follow through on these peace negotiations with all kinds of problematic results. Cory Aquino, chronically unable to put her house in order, in part because of constant coup attempts and constant problems of legitimacy. Fidel Ramos, first duly elected president in the wake of people power in 1986, was a little bit more successful. In part because he had the legitimacy, he was elected, unlike Cory Aquino, who came to power as a result of the coup. In part because he was, he is a military man, former chief of staff of Marcos, had been actively involved in the fighting and actually knew a lot of the fighters, a lot of the Muslim leaders because of his experience in the field, and so enjoyed a modicum of respect from the other Muslim fighters. Military men to military men, there was a measure of respect that they showed him. And thirdly, because Ramos's regime occurred at a time of relative prosperity for the Philippines. Things economically had started to stabilize, and that the active involvement this time, not of Middle Eastern countries of the OIC, but more of Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia in particular, Indonesia in particular, helped to broker an agreement such that, and I'm almost finished. I've got about 10 more minutes and then I'm done. Such that by 1996, Ramos is able to broker a new peace agreement with the MNLF. However, this peace agreement is brokered with one group, but at the expense of a breakaway group. This is, by the time you get to the 90s, the MNLF itself splits into two, and there is a breakaway group called the MILF, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, headed by Hashim Salamat, who had been part of the MNLF. Hashim Salamat, more Islamist, educated in Cairo, more committed to an Islamic state, much less interested in integration, right? Disagreed ideologically and politically with Noor Miswari, who had been the leader of the MNLF, broke from him. And in the process of this break, the Philippine government succeeded in brokering an agreement only with the MNLF, but without the MILF, so that in a way, and this would prove to be catastrophic in the future. This agreement, brokered in 1996, would provide, within the context of the Tripoli Agreement, would provide for the creation of an autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, otherwise known as ARM, which would consist of those provinces, as I said, that were predominantly Muslim. However, almost from the beginning, this agreement was doomed to failure. It met with fierce opposition from Christian settlers who balked the thought of having to live under a Muslim government. They detested the Muslims. They thought they were enemies. They were convinced that they were inferior. The idea of having to live under Muslim rule was something that they could not tolerate. And so they firstly opposed this. When elections were held, the 13 original provinces that were supposed to be part of the autonomous region shrunk to 4. Right? And eventually Noor Miswari himself was elected as governor. From the beginning, this ARM, as it's called, amounted to no more than a colonial dependency of Manila, constantly starved of resources, prone to constant corruption and problems of legitimacy. And as I said, prone to constant opposition, especially from the figure that would succeed Ramos, President Joseph Era Estrada, whose coming to power was in part related to his support of Christian settlers. Right? His power was in part because of the fact that Christian settlers in Mindanao supported him, and so he was totally opposed to ARM. And by 1998, as one would expect, the moment he rose to presidency, he resumed the war against the Muslims. This time with the MILF, because the MNLF had essentially broken apart. Some of them have been absorbed into the Philippine military. Others have gone on and become part of the MILF. A full-blown war emerged with the MILF as the central force. The MILF, however, for its part, was plagued with all sorts of problems. Number one, it was ethnically heterogeneous, right? There were Tausug's, there were Samals, there were all kinds of different ethnic groups, and not always in agreement. Secondly, an enduring gap between the leadership and the following. The leadership that was much more committed to the notion of an Islamic state, and a majority of its following that was much more interested in simple matters of survival, right? And therefore did not share the same sorts of ideological and religious commitments as its leaders. Compounded by the fact that by the early 1990s, there's yet another split, right? This is the story of these liberation movements. They split. Yet another split in the 1990s. There is the emergence of another breakaway group called the Abu Sayyaf, led largely by young Muslim men who had served as mujahideens in Afghanistan, some of whom had come to know Osama bin Laden, and were now committed to something entirely different from what had been in the Philippines. This Abu Sayyaf group were quite different, while the MILF continued to engage in conventional warfare, as well as on-again, off-again negotiations. The Abu Sayyaf, by contrast, were more intent on engaging in what they call jihad. Right? And this meant, among other things, launching several bombing attacks in Manila. This is precisely the time that the film Cavite, that you're going to see tomorrow, was set. Bombing, all these sort of bombings in Mindanao and so forth. However, with the death of its leaders, the Abu Sayyaf very quickly devolves into pretty much a kind of criminal racket kidnap for ransom racket, and the question of jihad itself it has become rather moot. Finally, making the situation even worse at present is Bush's, of course, war on terror, whatever that means. Among other things, this war on terror has meant that U.S. troops have now become a constant feature in the Mindanao landscape. Philippine government and the U.S. government have made